You know what that theme song means? That's right. It's another episode of the Senator Omer Raines Show. We invite you to listen to us at 1180 AM KCKQ, a Lotus broadcast radio station, as well as around the world on americamatters.us. The creator and the host of the show invite you to come join us here at the Reno Town Mall, get in the audience, or get behind a microphone. You can also text in questions to our chief engineer, Craig Moss, at 775-237-2266. But if you would like to speak with Senator Omer Raines or his guests, that number is 844-790-TALK. Again, it's 844-790-8255. Without further ado, let's get to the creator and host of the Senator Omer Raines Show, Senator Omer Raines.
Thank you, Eddie. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Omer Raines, welcoming you to America Matters Media, broadcasting this program to the world, not only in English, but by way of translation in various other languages as well. Now, as listeners of this program know, it is eclectic in nature. Thus, it does not focus solely on one topic or subject matter. However, the guest in whatever field and whatever the point of view is always interesting and well-informed. Nevertheless, whatever the topic, whomever the guest, we encourage diverse points of view. Although I ordinarily do this program alone, from time to time I invite someone to sit in as a co-host. Today's program is so important that I've asked Eddie Floyd to co-host and to chime in when he has a comment or question, because Eddie has made reference to our guest in some of his own interviews of Dr. James Forsyth and others. Thus, he knows of some of the accomplishments which we will be discussing during this program. Okay, Eddie gave you the call-in and text numbers, and with that in mind, I want to introduce today's program and today's guest, Dr. Daniel Peterson of the Cimarron Research Institute located in Incline Village, Lake Tahoe. Very briefly, Dr. Peterson was born in Milwaukee and received his bachelor's degree magna cum laude from Carleton College, Minnesota. He then received his MD degree from the University of Rochester School of Medicine in Rochester, New York in 1976. That was followed by a 3-year internship and residency at the University of Utah Medical Center in Salt Lake City. There is so much more to say about our guest, but I'm going to conclude this introduction by quoting from one of his patients, who, upon learning that Dr. Peterson would be today's guest, wrote me as follows, quote, "Dr. Peterson is world-renowned and has published his findings, spoken at conferences, and collaborated with scientists all over the world. Now he has received a much-coveted and prestigious National Institute of Health grant of over $9 million in collaboration with Columbia University. This distinguished man has truly devoted his professional life to helping others, along the way treating over 14,000 patients in 37 years of practice. In short, Mr. Raines, my doctor is a rock star."
I love it.
Now, Eddie, as you know, I've had as guests many famous and noteworthy people, but I've never before had a rock star.
That's right.
So let's meet our guest. Welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you very much.
So, Doctor, you are indeed famous throughout the medical world for your research, findings, and treatment of autoimmune disorders. Can you tell us how and when did you first become involved with these challenges?
Well, when I first moved to Lake Tahoe, I was a general internist, and I was planning to have a wonderful career with skiing and enjoying the environment and practicing internal medicine on the side. And this was the era, to take you way back, of HIV disease and a number of blossoming immunologically based diseases. And then, of course, I was involved in the Lake Tahoe epidemic of something that had been poorly and incompletely described for some time, characterized by these outbreaks of severe fatigue. And it was my really early impression that this had to be some kind of a viral onset, and it had to be connected to the immune system. And unfortunately, back then, we had very little in terms of basic, sophisticated lab tests, et cetera. And so we were somewhat hampered. And now, 30 years plus later, we have new tools, and very exciting things for the diagnosis and hopefully ultimately the treatment of this kind of disease.
You know, by complete surprise, Doctor, we have been joined by Dr. James Forsyth, himself renowned. And he has entered, and I'm going to ask him to also participate if he has the desire to do so. So
Yes.
let me
just say hi to Dan. Dan Peterson, a good friend of mine. In fact, Dan, you may recall in the early 80s, I was running North Tahoe Diagnostic Laboratory when you and Paul Cheney were basically getting off the ground with your chronic fatigue syndrome, at that time called the yuppie flu or chronic mono. It had a lot of different names, but finally it ended up with chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome. But you and I were good buddies at that time. I was trying to keep up with you lab-wise, but we didn't really have all the sophisticated lab resources that we have today, Dan.
I recall that collaboration really well, and I'm thankful for it.
Well, Doctor, you and I both saw a movie last night called Unrest, and it was a great movie, very profoundly moving. May have been a bit short on the science. I'd like to have your review of it, your thoughts of it. It was held at the University of Nevada, Reno, Health Sciences Building.
Sure, I'm a bit biased perhaps because I'm an insider on this, and I was a little surprised to see myself on those short clips. But I thought it was really outstanding with respect to painting a beautiful picture of how disabling the disease is, not only for the patient but for the extended family. And you can extrapolate that to the cost that it has on society in general in terms of lost work and lost productivity and lost quality of life. And I think the science that was implied was really the hallmark of chronic fatigue ME, and that's the post-exertional malaise. And that's a concept that's really hard to get across to people, but was really brilliantly portrayed in many, many scenes across the board.
Doctor, I'm going to interrupt only to say the following. This program is so profoundly important that I've been given permission to just continue on. We're going to skip the commercial break here. So go ahead. Now, you thereafter gained a reputation as a clinical immunologist. Is that correct?
Yes.
That was when what? When was that? Back in '84 or so?
Yeah, in the late 80s, yeah.
Now, when we speak of autoimmune disorders, are there different types of disorders that are in some way related?
Well, the autoimmune disorders, and Jim can address this perhaps better than I, but we had a poor understanding of the immune system in general, much less the autoimmune diseases that whereby the person's immune system is attacking themselves in one way or another. Just common examples that the lay people are aware of would be systemic lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and more close to these neuroimmune disorders would be things like multiple sclerosis, which is documented to be an autoimmune disease where the body is attacking the myelin sheath of the nervous system. Just recently, there's been increasing interest and published literature with respect to the autoimmune nature of CFS-ME.
Okay, when you say that, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's encephalomyelitis, sometimes known as chronic fatigue syndrome. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think hereafter we'll just refer to it as CFS. What is this disease? What are the symptoms?
Well, there's various definitions, and anyone who's familiar with this field knows we've had 30 years of controversy about the appropriate definition. And we have clinical case definitions and we have research definitions, but the primary symptom is prolonged fatigue of greater than 6 months duration that disables one by greater than 50%. The associated symptoms, and the one that I was so impressed by the dramatic presentation in the film was the post-exertional malaise. Because the vast majority of human diseases, people generally feel somewhat better with even a limited amount of exercise. And in this particular disorder, patients feel much, much worse and can become even bedridden for days or weeks. The other associated symptoms that are important, of course, are cognitive dysfunction, particularly difficulty in retrieving information, and non-restorative sleep. There's another associated groups of symptoms that some of the patients have, some don't, and the chief one is the orthostatic intolerance, or POTS.
Yeah, Dan, could I chime in here a little? Because as you remember, Dan, I was asked by the FDA in 2006 to write a national protocol for human growth hormone deficiency syndrome, which I did, and they signed off on. And one of the key things we've found over the years, and I think you will amplify this in your own work, was that patients who have CFIDs, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, don't get good sleep at night, and because of that, they don't get into deep REM sleep, and therefore do not produce HGH, which is produced only in deep REM sleep, only for a 15 to 30 minute period by the anterior pituitary in the middle of the night. So in those cases, those patients often have chronic insomnia, and they also suffer from adult growth hormone deficiency syndrome.
That is so true, and it's, again, discovery comes to the prepared mind. We sort of found that by accident in studying these people in more detail, and it's a really prominent laboratory finding as well, Jim. I agree with you.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Peterson, you mentioned a few of the related conditions. In doing some research for this program, I learned of those. CVIDs, I think you mentioned lupus, multiple sclerosis, but also mononucleosis and Lyme disease and Epstein-Barr and Coxsackie. Are all of those actually related?
Well, it's interesting because the disease can be triggered by a number of factors. There have been a large number of epidemiological studies looking at the triggering factors, and there's a subset that clearly had the onset with an acute viral illness, and in some cases we've even been able to establish what the virus was, such as Coxsackie or new onset Epstein-Barr virus or HHV6, particularly variant A, or Parvo virus, or any number of other agents. And that group of patients, we can identify them in 15 to 20% of the patients. There's others that had the onset during periods of severe stress, or after an automobile accident, or after a surgery, or after a vaccination, or some other triggering event that then was felt to be self-limiting, but in fact led to this chronic disease.
Dan, could I chime in here again? I wanted to ask you, do you think the correlation with Lyme disease, which Omer just mentioned, is real in that many patients with Lyme disease will be HHV6 positive as well? And it's been mentioned in some of the literature that this may be a co-infection where actually the spirochete, the Lyme spirochete, the Borrelia, will actually carry the HHV6 virus, and so the patient will get a dual infection. How do you feel about that, Dan?
Oh, we're finding, thanks to modern science, where we can do these PCRs and multiple pathogens, very fascinating things from both people who have been in vector-borne diseases, who have had mosquito infestations and bites, as well as tick bites. And you're absolutely right, Jim. There's a fascinating literature on Powassan virus and the flaviviruses in general that can come along with a tick bite. And I think we're just on the verge of discovering these more about these co-infections, and perhaps the Lyme organism itself is only a part of that broader picture.
Thank you.
What about Alzheimer's? Does that factor into the equation? I've heard of Myasthenia Gravis. I think that was in the movie last night. But are all of these, again, related? Or in your opinion, might they be related?
I'm not sure of the etiology of Alzheimer's disease, or the pathophysiology is well known, but not the etiology. So I can't comment on that. But certainly myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disease.
All right. Now, you haven't yet discussed the way in which you treat some of these, because you have become renowned throughout the medical world. And as a result, you clearly have enjoyed success that others have not enjoyed. Why is that? What are you doing that might be different, cutting edge?
Well, you have to remember that I'm an internist, and trained very classically in that field. So one of our obligations is not only to establish a diagnosis, but to institute measurements of prognosis to help the patient, and then to institute some type of effective therapy. And what we've come to do over the years is subdivide these people into definable subsets. And this whole field of post-infectious or chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, has really evolved into looking for homogeneous subsets that either share an onset or share a mechanism of action, and then we can get an actionable therapy. And I'll give you a few examples. Some of the patients had the onset with Parvo virus, and Parvo virus is quite treatable. Some of the patients had obvious evidence of an acute onset with a herpes virus, either Epstein-Barr virus or a CMV or HHV6 variant A or B or even HHV7. And we have fairly effective antivirals for that group of people.
Let me interrupt, because this is important.
Sure.
When you say some are quite treatable, in what way?
Well, one of the most interesting things is immune regulation. And one of the things we use in selective patients, for example, is supplemental gamma globulin, because it's a master immune modulator. It also has passive antibodies, but I think it actually works in the most of the diseases where it's utilized as an immune modulator. And in patients who meet the criteria, they can have dramatic responses and actually return to near normal state. We've done trials with
why is that? When you say they can possibly return to normal state, what is it about the gamma infusion that will allow that?
Well, part of the mechanism of action of these diseases is either upregulating or downregulating your immune system. And we can measure that now. There's cytokine profiles that are really quite accurate in determining whether the immune system profiling is up or down regulated. And there's actually a number of cytokine blockers that have come on the market now that I'm anxious to try in some controlled trials after pilot studies have been done. But if you take your immune system and it's super activated, let's say the inciting agent has come and gone, you can tone it down and many of the symptoms go away, and patients have significant recovery.
Now, you also use Ampligen, do you not?
Yes. In 1988, I went searching for a agent that was antiviral and immunomodulatory. And the reason for that, as Jim will recall, is that most of these patients have low natural killer cell function. Their numbers are normal, but they have low function. And that cell has a critical role in patients' health. It's a cell that's the first scavenger for when one is infected, and it searches for cancer cells, and it's kind of a primitive cell that we're really reliant on. And it was reproducible across societies that most of these patients have low NK cell function. So I was looking for an agent that was known to improve NK cell function was antiviral. So the one that was available to me was the drug that we now commonly call Ampligen. and it's gone through a number of studies, including a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and now is or was available for some patients for compassionate care.
Now, you and Dr. Forsythe, as trained physicians and renowned specialists, you may use terms that most of us are not familiar with. When you talked about CPR, what were you referencing?
Jim, do you want to answer about PCR?
Oh, PCR, excuse me.
PCR. PCR is a very high-tech laboratory technician where you can actually determine the molecular character of cells, and you can also multiply and replicate certain tissues and certain genes by PCR methods. So it's very, very high-tech. It's not in most laboratories. It has to go to a specialized laboratory for that to amplify certain genes and can amplify certain viruses. So it's been around for about 20 years, Omer, but it's something that is not commonly used by the average physician, only for research purposes.
Eddie has a comment here.
Thank you very much, Senator Raines. Dr. Dan, I have a question for you, and then maybe Dr. James Forsythe can also, remember, I'm a Florida graduate, and there's a lot of Florida graduates. There's a lot of Florida graduates out there. So when you say a double-blind placebo test, okay, explain that to the Florida graduates and the other listeners who might not truly understand what you meant.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. The way that drugs are researched in this country is they undergo phase 1 trials. This is after animal trials, and animal trials are established in order to look for safety generally. And then phase 1 trials, you get a very small pilot group of patients, and you try it on the patients to see if it's effective and see if there's any particular side effects that would preclude further studies. And then phase 2 trials, you generally go into a larger patient group looking for efficacy. And then phase 3 are double-blind placebo-controlled trials, which means usually half of the patients do not receive the active agent, the other half do. And then you follow them for efficacy, if it works or not, and for any toxicity. Then partway through the trial, you switch the limbs, and you take the person who was on the active drug and put them on placebo, and you take the placebo patients and treat them. And it's a very standard, quite sophisticated way to do drug trials.
So similar to the question I asked you earlier, you've mentioned gamma, and most of us are somewhat familiar with what that is, but you also mentioned something called ampligen. And I'd like you to explain the difference between ampligen and gamma, and what qualifies a patient for one or the other.
Yeah, sure. Gamma globulin is a concentrated product from multiple donors that is predominantly IgG and has an immunomodulatory effect on the immune system.
I'm going to interrupt again. What is IgG?
Oh, immunoglobulin G. It's one of the subfractions of the It's produced by B cells in all humans.
We're talking to people that probably are not nearly as conversant as either you or Dr. Forsythe.
Got you. Our B cells produce antibodies. It's a secondary response to infection. Ampligen, however, works on a Toll-3 receptor, and it's a receptor on the immune system that stimulates antiviral activity. And so it's particularly useful in patients who have a viral infection, as it stimulates that pathway which leads to the lysis or the destruction of a virus.
Now, I understand, somewhere I read, correct me if I'm wrong, that in Scandinavia, I think it might be Finland, there is also another modality or paradigm being created but not yet approved by FDA. Am I remembering something correctly?
Yes, they're using a drug, the trade name is Rituximab, and it's a drug that is actually destroys the B cells. And the logic there is that if this is an autoimmune disease mediated by the B cells and their products, that destroying them could alleviate the symptoms. And rituximab has been used for lymphoma and multiple sclerosis and a number of other diseases, and it's been around so long that it's off patent now.
Yes, Dan.
What the Norwegians...
Excuse me. I was going to say, Dan, that's in the oncology field. Remember, we started using that in the mid to late 90s for Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, and certain leukemias as well. So it is a anti-CD20 agent that goes after the lymphocytes that are labeled CD20. So it's been around, and it's quite effective. It's used in many non-Hodgkin's protocols as the R from rituximab, along with CHOP, which is CHOP. And those drugs are Cytoxan, Adriamycin, vincristine, and prednisone. Those five together produce about an 80% remission rate in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Yeah, where this came from historically is these very bright Norwegian doctors had some patients that had lymphoma and chronic fatigue. And they found that when they treated their lymphoma, their chronic fatigue went away with rituximab. So they've done very sophisticated trials. And in fact, they're just finishing their last trial, and we're all looking forward to the results for the following reasons. That's a very potent, very expensive therapy, and we need to know which patients would respond to that. So we need to know what subset, how to determine them, how to identify them, and then they would be a candidate for that therapy as well.
Now, why has it not been approved in the United States?
Rituximab is approved in the United States.
Yeah, Omer, it's approved for the conditions I said. It's mainly used in oncology, in the lymphomas, Hodgkin's disease, and multiple myeloma, and certain leukemias. So it is approved for those diseases which have CD20 cells as part of the problem.
Why is it that you do not try it with the autoimmune disorders, Dr. Peterson?
Oh, we do use it for all the approved uses, just like Jim said. It's not been... We were waiting for this large trial that was conducted in Norway before using it on chronic fatigue patients here, although it has been used off-label by some practitioners here.
So let's get into hurdles that you had to overcome. I know there's a lot of skepticism when it comes to autoimmune disorders. Many of them were pointed out in the movie last night. A lot of people think it's yuppie flu or severe dehydration or hysteria and, all sorts of skepticism. And how did you overcome those, or do they continue to exist? I mean, we saw some horrible examples last night. A young 14-year-old girl being taken by 5 policemen in Denmark and put into a psychiatric ward.
Yes, it's unfortunate that this disease that's more common than multiple sclerosis has been held back by prejudices such as those. I think if you want to know the etiology of it, it's probably because when you do superficial tests on these patients, as was pointed out in the movie, everything is normal. And so then the general practicing physician or psychiatrist or whatever jumps to the conclusion that then it has to be a somatoform disorder or a psychiatric disorder. And in certain parts of the world, there's not even an option that it could be a physiological disorder determined by infections with a genetic predisposition and immune dysregulation. It's just assumed to be, well, the worst case is hysteria or conversion reaction. And I think the film did a wonderful job of demonstrating how devastating that conclusion is to the extent of taking away a child from their home.
And Dan, may I chime in here a second? Because I had a personal experience when I was treating patients in the early 90s with Dan's protocol with gamma globulin in my set of chronic fatigue patients. And actually, I was called before the Board of Health Plan of Nevada, in which I had been previously the director of Health Plan of Nevada in Reno. And because there was no code for chronic fatigue syndrome at the time, I was accused of treating an unrecognized disease with an unrecognized therapy. And because of that, I actually got dropped from the panel, even though I had been director of the entire HMO at one time. So that's how bad it was at first, when the ignorance was so rampant throughout the community that and now, of course, almost all communities have CFIDS support groups.
And CFIDS is common variable immune disorder?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chronic fatigue immune dysfunction is what it stands for.
Okay. Now, have you had any endeavors to get either state or federal money before this NIH grant?
Well, it's been a very interesting journey, and one of the sad things is that the federal government has spent a pittance on this disease over 30 years, and they have done some things that I would like to stress have been beneficial. The CDC has done epidemiological studies and has really done quite a good job of determining how many people are affected and how sick they are. But of course, their mission is not to do diagnostics or treatment. The NIH itself has really continuously ignored this disease. I can say that pretty much by personal experience. From time to time, they would approve a grant in R21, which is a relatively small study that usually explores one idea. Those are limited usually to $250,000. And there's been an occasional R01 to study in more detail some aspect of the disease. But in almost all those cases, we had to disguise what disease we were studying. We had to just say, we're studying sick people that have cognitive dysfunction and fatigue. Because as soon as you said CFSME, it never made it out of the committee review. So it's just recently. There were center grants established somewhere in the 90s that were not refunded, and they were basically, again, to count heads and to determine demographics. So this latest round that was instituted predominantly by the patients, who raised a lot of commotion in D.C., and finally it was with a change of management and heart at NIH, it was decided that they would send out requests for funding for grants, for center grants, which was an idea that I've been working on for about 20 years for centers of excellence. And as you mentioned, Omer, that they were just funded and identified, and there's 3 grants and that are renewable for 5 years, and hopefully that will bring us some real collaborative medicine, and hopefully actually translational medicine, which means all these metabolomic studies and detailed pathophysiological studies will come to bear fruit, and ultimately better diagnostic techniques and ultimately treatment for these patients.
Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
I'm sorry, Senator Raines, but Doctor, I have another University of Florida question for you. Okay. Ready? And this is very simple. You know, I am amazed sometimes at some of the decisions these committees working with the AMA, they make them, and sometimes I feel as if things are kicked out of committee because of the old adage, follow the dollar. Don't upset the apple cart. Am I right or wrong, sir?
Oh, yeah. The NIH has limited funding, for example, and so they go to the squeaky wheel, and you know, there's things that have been funded that 10 times the amount of chronic fatigue that affect a very small number of people. And there's a lot of politics involved in that. And, the review committees, for years, chronic fatigue did not have its own review committee. It was thrown in with women's health, and which did a lot of things like education of women's diseases and things like that. It was a totally inappropriate assignment of this disorder, but it's where it ended up in. So I want to stress that most of the research done in the early years, and this is just beginning to change, was privately funded. And private funding to the magnitude necessary in a disease like this that's so complex is very, very difficult to raise. And what most people have come to realize is the vast number of treatment modalities that are brought to market are funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry has never been interested in this disease.
When you mention women's health, is it a fact that more women than men get autoimmune disorders? And if so, why do you think that is?
Oh, yes. By almost every autoimmune disease has a predominance of women. It depends on the disease. But in this particular disorder, CFSME, in my center, it's about 60% women and 40% men. Other places, it's much more skewed to women. And it's been studied extensively in some of the other diseases, whether it's hormonal or genetic in the sense of having two X's instead of an XY makes a difference in these disorders. But I don't think it's been clarified in chronic fatigue syndrome.
Okay, well, tell us a bit more.
We're going to keep going. There'll be no breaks during this very important show with Senator Omer Raines, Dr. Dan, and Dr. James Forsythe.
So, Doctor, tell us now about the recently awarded NIH grant. I know it was coveted. A lot of people wanted to have access to those monies. You were selected along with Columbia University and some others. Tell us about that. Number one, what you did to, provide the credibility to have NIH look to you and award to you, and also with whom are you going to be collaborating? Is it mainly Columbia University, maybe Cornell, and perhaps others?
Sure. The way that this grant was worded was that the centers that were applying had to have expertise in a whole variety of research capacities. And on top of that, they had to have statistical capabilities to analyze the data collected, and on top of that, they had to have collaboration with clinicians. And that's the nature of translational medicine. There's interesting pieces that were included in the Columbia grant, of which Dr. Ian Lipkin, who's very famous as a virus hunter and a brilliant mind in terms of medical research, and he also included in this request not only clinical sites across the country, but an effort to educate physicians and ultimately a treatment protocol. And I think the depth and thoroughness of this particular application with all those aspects was why we were lucky enough and fortunate enough to get funded. The other grant that's been funded that I'm most familiar with is with Cornell, and I've worked with Maureen Hansen there for a number of years, and she's trying to define scientifically what is causing post-exertional malaise, that hallmark feature of why you feel worse after either mental or physical exertion. And the third center grant is going to be looking at a number of issues with respect to chronic fatigue and looking at a number of different tissues. And so it'll be going in collaboration and in parallel. And one of the things is we always do blood tests, but blood is just the easiest source of specimen. The disease may actually lie in the organs or in the spinal fluid or be related to the gut. I'm sure all of you are aware of the studies now with the microbiome and what impact our gut has on our health. Something like 80% of the human immune system is in the gut. And all of these grants are addressing the gut microbiome and if there's a particular derangement. So these are exciting centers. All of the grants were good, all of the requests, and hopefully this will stimulate more funding and more interest at the NIH and hopefully medical schools and really hopefully pharmaceutical companies.
How do you specifically intend to proceed with your research?
We actually haven't had our first big investigators meeting, but we hope to enroll the best possible patients in this as subjects to donate their histories, their concomitant medication use, what has worked, what hasn't worked, as well as their blood, spinal fluid, urine, feces, or whatever else is necessary for this kind of comprehensive study. And then the hope is when we get all of this data back, which should be a tremendous number of points to analyze, that the center, which was also funded for data management, will be able to come up with some concrete ideas about the pathogenesis or what causes this and what can be done about it.
Yeah, Dan, and I was going to ask you also, in my practice of integrative oncology, which I do genomic testing first and then do only low-dose insulin-potentiated therapy, and we're seeing about a 30-time greater survival rate than is reported in the conventional literature of 2.1% at 5 years of chemo in adult cancers. And we're getting 70% at 7 years in 1,250 patients at the current time. A lot of times we will be stimulating the immune system with things like IP6, moringa, some of the mushroom extracts like agaricus, BM blazei, things like some of the algae products like fucoidan and hucoidan, which have immunostimulating properties. I wonder if you have entertained the use of any of those. We have the advantage, Dan, because when we do circulating tumor cells, the tests, the genetic labs that we use will actually identify for each individual the exact number and kind of supplements, vitamins, minerals, and herbs we're talking about here, that are helpful for that cancer. And so we're not only giving the best chemo, the two best chemo drugs in low dose, but we're also giving 16 to 25 supplements to that patient.
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned and studied. These certainly are biologically active agents, and they require your kind of expertise in terms of management. But I think there's certainly a role. The film kind of talked about things that people do to themselves, oftentimes without management or without knowledge of the effects. And I think we'll enter a new era where complementary medicine plays a role in all of these patients. One of the things that the patients do now are fecal transplants without really any evidence as to why that would be beneficial or have an impact in CFSME, but it certainly has had an impact in other diseases such as C. difficile, colitis, etc.
Yeah, and leaky gut syndrome and things like that as well. And probiotics as well. I'm sure you've looked into all that, Dan.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Doctor, how will patients be selected for the clinical studies that you will undertake?
They'll be drawn from our existing patient databases. For example, the CDC study is now entering its fifth year of follow-up, and those are extremely well-characterized patients where we have lots of demographics and background information, and I hope to draw from that group of patients. We've already done the pilot work, and a group of 50 patients and 50 controls have been already selected and are in the process. We don't know yet exactly the criteria for this particular center grant and how many patients are going to be enrolled, et cetera, but that's our plan. And certainly we could accommodate newcomers to the scene if they meet the criteria.
Where will this ongoing and perhaps advanced research take place?
Each of the centers has a base, and the principal investigator, Dr. Lipkin, is based at Columbia in New York City. And then there's a number of collaborators actually across the United States based on their expertise.
Well, now you have the Cimarron Research Institute right at Lake Tahoe in Incline Village. Will some of it take place there?
Yes. What we do here is we do pilot projects such as participating in a big center grant like this, which are manageable with a relatively small staff and a relatively small budget in order to get patients into the mainstream of research. And again, the whole goal is to understand the disease better, but also to come up with treatment and management strategies to improve the quality of life. And again, getting back to the film, I thought the producer did a great job of saying that it's one thing to accept the disease and accept your disability, but we really have to have more positive directions into treatment strategies, et cetera.
Are you going to be bringing the medical staff at the University of Nevada, Reno also into this program?
We very much hope to collaborate. As you know, they have a center that's dedicated to the study of chronic fatigue syndrome and related disorders, and I know they have some researchers there, such as Dr. Lombardi, who have a great deal of experience in this, and it certainly would be a great collaboration, both in terms of basic science and in terms of clinical management of these patients.
Is that at the what's called the Whittemore Peterson being you, Institute at UNR?
That was the old name, but yes, that's the facility.
Dan, could I chime in here again? Could you recount for the audience listening, I'm pretty familiar with it, but all the things you've gone through over the years as far as treatment? I know you used intravenous Zovirax, an antiviral commonly used in herpes 1 and 2, and magnesium, and I think even IV silver, colloidal silver, I believe you've used. Could you go through that for us quickly, just to recount that?
Oh, sure. We've gone through a number of things that weren't felt to be efficacious. There's antivirals such as Immunoglobulin that has not been found to be beneficial. The standard treatment for orthostatic intolerance is, but it's somewhat poorly tolerated by these patients, meaning, Florinef and Midodrine and Mestinon and, up the line there for those drugs. We've tried a number of supplements, and coenzyme Q is one of the things that's known to stimulate NK cell function, and we've incorporated this in the individual treatment protocol for people. I think of the big agents that have been beneficial, certainly the patients with herpes virus reactivation, the Volsite, which is more effective for CMV, and EBV have been useful. We sometimes use IV cidofovir depending on what the infection is. Intravenous gamma globulin. Ampligen is not commercially available at the present time, and there's not a applicable compassionate care study right now. We certainly do symptomatic therapy. One of the most interesting things, Jim, is I'm really excited about trying the cytokine blockers. Many of these patients have an inflammatory profile with high IL-6, IL-8, and a suppressed IL-10, and an elevated IL-17. And all of these agents that are being used now for skin conditions and inflammatory bowel disease, et cetera, are commercially available. It's just that we don't know which ones to try on which patients. But I'm hopefully that this kind of center grant approach will help us to, get some markers about who should be treated with which therapy.
Doctor, how many people in the United States, as best we know, suffer from these autoimmune disorders, and perhaps secondly, how many worldwide?
Well, I'll just limit my comments to chronic fatigue syndrome, so ME. So there's at least between 1 and 3 million people in the United States that are fairly well documented. They've been tracked, et cetera. How many are undiagnosed? One only knows what the tip of the iceberg is. And if you use those statistics, there's probably 20 million people worldwide. Interestingly, wherever CFS-ME has been studied, the incidence has been about the same, which really brings a credibility. It's hard for me to believe that scientists still claim the disease doesn't exist.
Doctor, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
And multiple sclerosis is a well-known autoimmune disease, is about that half that number.
Before we run out of time, can you tell us if these diseases or disorders are genetic or transferable, and if transmittable, in what way?
Oh, that's a loaded last question here. We've known from DNA studies that there's a genetic predisposition, but there's clearly a genetic predisposition to most human diseases. We've also looked at the next step in the chain. There is the RNA and gene expression. Which of these genes we have are actually been expressed at a given time, and there's some evidence that we can do expression profiles and learn more about the disease. Going on with the chain, there's the proteomics. We've looked at the proteins that are produced by these active genes, and there's some patterns there that may be useful. And then we've looked at the metabolomics, and that's actually the chemical products.
One last question. You can answer yes or no. With medicine evolving at warp speed, could your research possibly result in new paradigms or preventing or perhaps even reversing autoimmune diseases?